Hello, welcome back to my YouTube channel. My name is Roxy and this is my YouTube channel where I plan on documenting my journey with long COVID. In this video I'll be talking a little bit about the early symptoms I experienced after getting my COVID infection, including the first seizure I had. I started experiencing symptoms of hair loss approximately 2 months after my first COVID infection. I got COVID for the first time in July 2022 and I started experiencing hair loss in September 2022. I experienced hair loss from my head and from my eyebrows. I also experienced a worsening of nystagmus. I hope I pronounced that correctly. I'll put it on the screen so you can see how it is spelt. It would feel like my eyeballs are rapidly moving uncontrollably, shaking from side to side. It feels like my eyeballs are shaking or there's an earthquake happening. It feels like the entire of my room is shaking. So I've been experiencing it at the time for at least 10 years. I can't remember if I experienced it in childhood. I didn't know what it was called or what it was. I hadn't even told anybody. I didn't think it was relevant because it wasn't permanent. It would happen periodically, but after I got COVID, it got a lot more frequent and a lot worse. When I got COVID, I told my doctor because I thought it might be relevant given I'd started experiencing seizures as well. The nystagmus got a lot worse between the months of September, October, November and December of 2022. In those autumn months, I experienced very severe insomnia. I experienced very severe insomnia between the months of September 2022 and March, April 2023. And the only reason the insomnia improved was because I started taking mast cell stabilizers. I'd experienced really bad insomnia for most of my adult life, but mainly due to the environment I was living in psychiatric hospitals, as well as poor mental health such as depression, severe anxiety, and eating disorders. This was insomnia that was far worse than I'd ever experienced before. I think at the worst I was only sleeping 1 or 2 hours per night, every night. I looked exhausted all of the time and I felt awful all of the time, and most of all I just wanted to sleep, but it felt like my mind and brain were wired. It felt like my brain thought it was daytime. It couldn't switch off. It was just completely wired and I was up most of the night no matter how hard I tried to sleep. No matter how much I worked on my sleep hygiene, nothing was working. Prior to getting COVID, I didn't struggle with my sleep. I was in a really healthy place mentally and physically, and so my sleep was really good. I used to go to sleep at 9 p.m. every night and I'd sleep all the way through until 6 a.m. the next morning, and I'd wake up feeling great. I would feel refreshed and I'd have lots of energy and I'd bounce out of bed in the mornings like Tigger. I just had so much energy and I couldn't wait to start the day, and it was partly because I was sleeping so well. I was eating a whole food plant-based diet at the time when I got COVID, and I did for the next few years after getting COVID. And this is quite relevant to my story because my diet was very high in histamine and I didn't know anything about histamine at the time. So I was actually eating a diet without knowing that it was making me very sick. Before I had COVID, I was in a really good place mentally and physically, and I felt really well, and I was eating a lot of food and I was exercising a lot and I just felt really strong and I was in a really good place. But when I got COVID, after that, everything changed and I couldn't sleep and all food started to make me very ill. When I got COVID, I became quite ill very quickly, and so I stopped doing everything. I stopped all the activities I was doing, I stopped volunteering, I stopped going to the gym, I stopped leaving the hospital grounds. I was in a psychiatric hospital at the time, an informal patient, which means that I wasn't legally detained, so I could leave the hospital whenever I wanted to. I could go and I could come back without having to ask for permission to leave the hospital, and so I was going out quite a bit at the time because I was also due to leave hospital. I was just simply waiting for somewhere to live. I needed suitable accommodation so that I could leave the psychiatric hospital, but I was free to go out and about whenever I wanted to because I wasn't under a section. I was there as an informal patient. But after I got COVID, because I became quite ill very quickly from dissociation and later with seizures, I no longer could leave the hospital. I wasn't sectioned, I wasn't legally detained, but I couldn't go out much because of how unbelievably mentally and physically ill I was. I'll insert now a few pictures of what I looked like before my COVID infection. And I'll insert some pictures now of what I was looking like in the autumn of 2022, around the same time that my seizures started. Something I'll talk more about in future videos is how COVID changed my handwriting a lot. My handwriting is terrible now since having COVID. Bad handwriting started very soon after my first COVID infection, even before my first seizure. I've been keeping a diary since I was 15 years old, and so my entire life story is handwritten in many notebooks. So I know that my handwriting changed very early on because I can see it in my diary. My handwriting got dramatically worse in the following 8 months after my COVID infection, and to this day, now it's been almost 3.5 years since I got COVID. To this day now my handwriting is terrible, but I'll talk about that in another video. The first seizure I had, I remember very clearly, it was Sunday the 30th of October 2022. At the time I was experiencing quite bad dissociation, and so I went over to the main building of the hospital to tell somebody that I didn't feel right. I remember distinctly there was this impending doom sort of feeling that I had, and I just felt like something terrible was about to happen. I now know that this is a seizure warning sign, which I'll talk about in future videos, but this feeling of impending doom, seizure warning sign that I sometimes still experience before I have a seizure. What is key to my story of seizures, and this particular seizure that I had, was that I had just eaten before the seizure occurred. I didn't know that food was a big trigger for my seizures because this was the first seizure I'd experienced with severe dystonia, but I now know that food is a massive trigger for my seizures. And so I had just eaten just before I went over to the main building to say that I didn't feel well and that something felt wrong. I remember clearly that I just about made it in time to the main building of the hospital to tell the nurse that I didn't feel well. My eyes became locked and fixated on what was in front of me, and I just simply stopped talking and fell to the floor. I immediately started violently convulsing on the floor, shaking from head to toe and sweating all over my body, to the point where my clothes were drenched in sweat by the end of the seizure. My arms were stiff and rock solid, twisted back behind me, and my hands were curled like this and like this. I didn't know at the time, but this was dystonia I was experiencing during the seizure. And from here on in, I've continued to experience very severe dystonia during my seizures. Dystonia is a topic that I'll talk about in another future video, because I have a lot to say about it, and for me, dystonia and seizures have always been my worst symptoms, and so I think I'll make future videos about it in detail. But for now, I'll just say that dystonia is where the muscles in someone's body, and it can be isolated to certain body parts like the hand or the arm or the face, or it can be someone's whole body, but in my case it varies. It's where the muscles get contracted and stuck and rigid and stiff, and they lock in very uncomfortable and unusual positions. In my case, it's badly affected my arms and my wrist during the seizures, and so it can look a bit odd if my arm is stuck in the air backwards during a seizure. This seizure-like episode was unique in that it wasn't a usual seizure. It wasn't even a usual non-epileptic seizure. This was what people call seizure-like activity, where it looks like a seizure and it feels like a seizure, but because of the length of time it was going on for, it wasn't presenting as a usual seizure. All of the seizure-like events that I experienced between October 2022 and December 2022, for those 2 months, every seizure I had was unusual in not only the presentation, but the length of time specifically. And so these episodes would be going on for hours. This particular episode lasted just under 2 hours, non-stop, with me shaking head to toe, with my arms and limbs twisted back behind me. My legs were twisted back behind me and rigid. My arms were twisted back behind me and rigid, and my neck was also twisted backwards. I was very contorted in this seizure, and I remember it clearly. The ambulance arrived, they gave me oxygen, but I ended up using all of their oxygen because the seizure wouldn't stop. You might be thinking, well, it's not possible for someone to have a seizure for 2 hours. It's not physically possible for someone to be shaking for that long. And I guess in a way, you're right in what you're thinking, because it wasn't a usual seizure. It was a seizure-like event, but it did last just under 2 hours non-stop. I was violently shaking head to toe, my teeth were clenched shut, my eyes were open, I had awareness that it was happening, but I couldn't talk, I couldn't move in my control, and I couldn't communicate. Those 2 months between October 2022 and December 2022, every episode I had was very prolonged. After December 2022, from the January of 2023 onwards, the seizure length only was a few minutes. I would cluster, and so I'd go in and out for hours, but I would never have a seizure event that lasted non-stop for, say, 1 hour, 2 hours, half an hour. I'd last a matter of minutes, and then the seizure would end, and I'd go out of the seizure and come back into the seizure, and that would go on for hours. The clustering would go on for hours, and still can go on for hours, but the seizures themselves don't last hours anymore. The seizures have changed a lot in presentation, and so I don't always have tonic-clonic or tonic seizures anymore. But at the time when I first started having seizures, I was pretty much only having tonic-clonic seizures for those first 2 months. At the time, it felt like these seizure-like events were happening every day, all day. It felt like the seizures that went on for that long went on for much more than just 2 months. So it was only 2 months that I had these prolonged episodes, but when it's happening at the time, 2 months is still a very long time to be shaking head to toe for many hours of the day. On some days, it was also happening several times a day. During this first seizure, when they called the ambulance, I remember at one point the nurse stood up and said, "Oh my goodness, I've never seen anything like this before, have you?" And she said that to the paramedic. And I remember clearly the paramedic said, "I've seen non-epileptic seizures before," but he said, "but I've never seen anything like this before." And he was right in what he was saying, because this wasn't a usual non-epileptic seizure. We didn't know it at the time, but this had stemmed from COVID. And for whatever reason, it had triggered a seizure-like event that lasted almost 2 hours. And that's not always usual for a non-epileptic seizure. Not only that, but the presentation of the seizure, I think, is what was most alarming to both the staff at the hospital I was at, as well as the paramedics. I'm not sure many people have seen severe dystonia during a seizure, and so I think they were a bit confused by the presentation. I didn't know that the seizure had gone on for so long until I came out of it and the staff told me how long it had been. I knew it had been going on for a long time, but whilst it was happening, I had no idea that almost 2 hours had passed. My eyes were wide open so I could see whatever was in front of me, or if my head was tilted backwards, I could see whatever was behind me, but I couldn't move my eyes, and I couldn't communicate, and I couldn't talk. Don't always realise that you can have some awareness whilst someone is having a seizure. I think there's a misconception with seizures where people assume that someone falls to the floor and has a seizure, they're shaking and their eyes are closed and they're out of it, and they don't know what's happening, and they wake up and they realise, oh, I must have had a seizure. But actually that's not the case for everybody, and in my case I've never lost awareness during a seizure. Even when I've had tonic-clonic seizures, I've always had some level of awareness during them, and that means that I've never come out of a seizure and not known that I've just had a seizure. But usually when people have tonic-clonic seizures, they do lose awareness, so I think my particular case is unusual. I could hear everything around me, I could hear what people were saying, I could hear everything, but I just couldn't communicate and I couldn't talk, and any movement that was happening was out of my control. I remember the other paramedic was actually less sympathetic. I remember his response was, "You'll be surprised at how long they can make these things last for." And I heard this because obviously I could hear what was happening around me, but I'm not sure they were aware that I could hear what was happening around me. That meant that he was assuming that I was making it up. He was assuming that I was in control of what was happening to me. He was assuming that the seizure was either put on or that I had control over it. I was in excruciating amounts of pain because my limbs were contorted in very odd positions, and it was causing me a lot of pain because all of my muscles were very rigid and very stiff, and you couldn't force my muscles to relax. It was impossible to fake It was impossible for someone to put that on, but he believed that I was putting it on. He came over to me at one point and he said I should stop doing what I'm doing because I'm the only person to be able to help myself. And he said that to me whilst the seizure event was happening. The other paramedic was a lot kinder and he was a lot more caring. Because I was in a psychiatric hospital at the time, I did continue to hear many comments like this from paramedics and or A&E staff in the many, many months that I continued to have seizures. The comment was very hurtful, and it's been 3.5 years and I've not forgotten that comment, and I haven't forgotten any of the other similar comments I continued to hear for the following few more months afterwards. And unfortunately, non-epileptic seizures are very misunderstood in the medical world, and there's not enough research done into them, and there's not enough awareness about them. So very outdated information implies that the person's seizures or seizure-like events have happened as a result of their mind or because they're putting it on. Unfortunately, because I was in a psychiatric hospital at the time, I do believe this really negatively impacted any treatment I received from paramedics and or staff in A&E, because unfortunately there is a huge stigma that some people in psychiatric hospitals may fake seizures, and unfortunately this meant that I was treated poorly at times by some paramedics or A&E staff because I was living in a psychiatric hospital at the time, even though I had no history of ever having attended A&E in the entire time that I've been in that hospital. I'd never attended A&E, but because they saw my records that I was a resident at a psychiatric hospital, I don't believe I was taken seriously at all, and this really is very harmful actually in terms of trying to get any help or support or treatment for what I was experiencing. Eventually, after almost 2 hours, the shaking and seizure-like event stopped. I was so weak that I could barely walk. I could barely talk. I lost my speech. All of my clothes were soaking wet from sweat because I had been shaking so violently, and I felt extremely faint. I felt really very weird, and I felt very faint, and I felt like I was going to be sick, and my head hurt a lot. It just felt like I was going to vomit. But to be honest with you, because I was shaking so much, that would make sense. Remember, I lost my ability to speak, so I wanted to speak, but I couldn't speak, which was extremely frustrating, and it took a while for my speech to return. When I was writing what had just happened to me in my seizure diary, I had written also that my senses were extremely heightened after seizures. I'm autistic, and so my senses are naturally very heightened, but this was something else. This was something I'd never experienced in my life before. All of my senses were extremely amplified, and I was just experiencing the world in a very odd way in comparison to how I would usually experience the world. I went to bed, but I hadn't been able to process anything that had just happened to me. I was feeling so unbelievably ill, and I just went to sleep. I know what I was experiencing during the seizure because I had awareness, but I also kept a symptom diary. From the moment I had my first seizure, I kept a symptom seizure diary, and that's why I know all of the information that I've just described, because I'd written it all down. If I hadn't written down a seizure diary, I would have next to no recollection of any of this. I have some memory, of course, of the seizure-like events and everything that's happened over the past few years, but my memory has been badly affected since I got COVID and since I had so many seizures over the last almost 4 years. I'm really glad that past me kept a symptom and seizure diary, because every day for the past 3.5 years I have been able to write all of my health symptoms down. I've been able to write what I was doing, where I was going, what was happening when I've been experiencing these symptoms, and so I can describe very clearly what was going on for me at the time that I was going through this. It's been almost 4 years since I got COVID, and I've been writing a seizure and symptom diary since my symptoms started, every single day. And I really recommend someone does this if they experience any health symptoms, because it's really helpful to be able to see a timeline of when things started and any triggers that might be triggering symptoms to happen. I honestly wish I had video footage of the seizure-like events that were happening between those 2 months where they were very prolonged, because obviously I was having these seizure events, and so I was unable to communicate or talk to anyone or do anything other than be in a seizure. And so I was unable to ask anybody to film the seizure whilst it was happening, or film obviously parts of it, not the entire thing. One of the reasons why I wish I had more footage of these particular events is because I want people to see what exactly COVID can do to somebody's brain. I have next to no footage of it. Thank God every day that the seizures I experience now are nothing like the seizures I used to experience during those first 2 months, but they were extremely, extremely bad. The only footage I have from those 2 months when they first started is one short video clip which a staff member took for me whilst I was having the seizure event. They had my consent prior to the episode to film parts of it, purely to be able to show the neurologist when I saw them. I had an upcoming neurology appointment at the time, and I had read online that it's extremely helpful if you have video footage to be able to show the neurologist when you have a seizure, because you might not necessarily have a seizure whilst you're in your neurology appointment. And so it's really helpful to have video footage to be able to bring to the appointment to show them. And actually I was right in this, because when I did eventually see the neurologist, he was very happy that I already had footage to be able to show him. All of the other seizures I have footage of from January 2024 onwards, because at that point I was trying to deal with the seizures myself, so I would set up my camera in my room before they happened. I was due to be discharged, and so I knew that in order to be able to live by myself, I had to be in a position where I could deal with the seizures myself. But that one clip that I do have is actually representative of what all of the episodes were looking like. That's because my seizure presentation was rapidly changing each time it happened. Although I do have a lot of seizure and symptom footage on my phone that I've documented, I have no footage of what I was like at my worst. Because when I was at my worst, I was in no fit position to be thinking about getting my camera out and filming myself, or getting my camera out and asking anybody else to film me. I do not have much footage at all from the first year that I had COVID, and that's because I was just so unbelievably sick. So I guess I just want people to be aware of this also. Anything you do see that I post in future videos or in this video is not at the worst of what COVID has done to me. And I think it's important that people know that, because it's not the first thing that I think of when I got ill. I started filming to be able to show the doctors and neurologists, and still do film to be able to show the doctors and neurologists. But I never started filming to be able to post any of this online until more recently, where I decided that actually this might be able to help somebody else. The second seizure-like event that happened was the next day. The next day, a very similar seizure event happened where I didn't feel very well, and then I suddenly fell to the floor and started violently convulsing. And again, I experienced severe dystonia where my limbs were very contorted and twisted back behind me, and my arm was in the air like this, and my muscles were very stiff. And I had my eyes open, and I had a lot of saliva coming out of my mouth, and I was shaking from head to toe, drenched in sweat. I remember feeling really, really mortified that it happened again. And again, the key part of the story is that I had just eaten just before this had happened. This one presented very similarly in that my hand was like a claw and my arm was in the air backwards, and I was shaking head to toe. After 40 minutes of non-stop convulsing, I was given intramuscular muscle laxants and oxygen, but this didn't stop the seizure immediately. Unfortunately, I have a very delayed reaction to all medication, and so if someone gives me intramuscular medication, it doesn't start to kick in for 2 hours later. Paramedics were called again because the seizure wasn't stopping, and unfortunately I had another poor experience with the paramedics. These paramedics also thought that I was putting it on, which again is impossible, but they thought I was putting it on, and I do strongly believe that this was because I was in a psychiatric hospital at the time, and so they assumed that this was fake. Possible to fake someone violently fitting head to toe with saliva coming out of their mouth and their muscles very, very stiff and rock solid, and their arm twisted in the air backwards for very prolonged periods of time. It's not possible to fake that, but unfortunately they assumed I was faking because I was in a psychiatric hospital. After I came out of the seizure and I'd written in my seizure diary later that day what had happened, once again I'd written I had just eaten whatever I'd eaten, before the seizure occurred. I continued to write this for almost every seizure I had over the next 3.5 years. Eating was a huge trigger for the seizures occurring. Though all of the seizures from October 2022 appeared to be triggered after I ate, there were signs that food was making me very unwell earlier than that. I remember in the September of 2022, I'd gone for pizza with somebody, and I remember looking in the mirror in the restaurant and I was white as a ghost. The colour of my skin was extremely pale, and I just looked very ill. And I remember looking in the mirror and looking like I already looked like I've lost weight unintentionally. I didn't feel very well, and I remember after I ate the pizza, immediately afterwards, I said to the person that I was with, I don't feel very well, I think we need to go back to the hospital. And so we returned. I think that's all I'm going to say in this video, but I've got a lot more to say about these seizure-like events that happened over those 2 months between October 2022 and December 2022. I'm going to make future videos about them. Thanks for watching. I hope you found it interesting, and I hope you learned something new. And I'll see you in another video. Bye.